Welcome to Bent TV. You're with Casey Martin-Stone. I'm Australia's only archaeologist comedian, and I am joined today by
Alice Fraser, podcaster and comedian.
Lisa-Skye, femme daddy and hedonism muse.
Awesome. We're here today to talk about comedy and how we use consent in our comedy, and also talking about relationships in comedy.
Yes, which I don't.
You don't talk about relationships in comedy at all?
No, I don't. I decided very early on that I was never going to talk about my sexuality or my relationships on stage, partly because at the time I started that was all that female comedians and female presenting comedians were talking about, and I sort of thought I didn't want to do that. I quite like the idea of having an artistic restraint. I think that helps you kind of push further and push more boundaries.
Liberating restraints.
Yeah, and then also not talking about my own personal experiences means that I can speak about other people's lives with a kind of a more academic approach. It's not always about me. It can be, oh, this is an interesting thing that happens.
Did you ever worry that it would lessen the impact if you weren't talking from personal experience, that if you were being more academic about an issue?
That's the constraint, right? Which it means you have to work harder to get what you want to say across. You can't lean on your own experience. For me, it could have come across as lazy.
Rude, just at me next time. Yeah, because I find this fascinating because I genuinely have built a career on talking about my non-normative intimacies and my gender and my sexuality and my love life.
How do your partners feel about being discussed on stage?
There are some things I'm not allowed to talk about because I have some partners who are deeply, deeply private people. I have some partners who are as show pony as me, and they're like, tell everyone. Although I did have to get consent for a particularly spicy story that was really funny. It depends, like if it's just a kind of funny, sweet thing, or if I'm the focus of the story, I don't feel like I need to get consent. But if it's, for example, an entire show about how I love one of my partners, then I'm like, is it all right? I tend to talk in broad strokes rather than actual experiences. And if I talk about actual experiences, for example, with my submissive, I don't name them. But I do that Phil Collins in the Air Tonight thing where I invite them to the show and just point at them not point at them, but just look at them while I'm telling the story. Because you know how Phil Collins
uncomfortable at all.
Tonight, and then the boy drowned in camp, and then he went 30 years, oh, I write song about you.
I didn't know that.
It's a fact,
Well, I think it's interesting because there's a number of different ways to get a personal connection. There's a number of different ways to bring people into your story, and one is being very specific about your story and the things that are strange and unique, and people are very interested in that. And the other way is to kind of leave it very open and have a kind of a funnel in. If you articulate an idea precisely enough, then you don't have to give an example, maybe.
Possibly. I think when it comes to performing comedy, I fall halfway between the two of you, where I do mention relationships. I tend to mention that 6 months after the fact, and so I give it time, a story, time to settle in my mind, and often the relationship's gone by that point, and then I feel if they're not identified and I handle it in a respectful way, then it's okay to talk about.
I've made that mistake before. It definitely needs time. I've had like really funny or weird or interesting things happen in my private life, and I've gone on stage and been like, dudes, look at this, and it's just not funny because I don't have that distance. I don't have that, I guess, wisdom of hindsight. But also, I mean, you guys are way smarter than me, so you're kind of better at articulating things without going, like, because I'm John Example. Like, I've never met a metaphor or a simile that I don't like. It's just, yes. It's interesting to see, like, I really want to tell this story. I'm going to have to wait a bit. Fun fact, I once, one of my solo shows, Spiders Wearing Party Hats, which is one of the best solo shows I've ever done, and I still tour it around to some places who haven't seen it because everyone needs to. I wrote a whole bit about my girlfriend at the time and how perfect she was and how wonderful and da-da-da. And then obviously we broke up during the course of touring that show. And my director said, okay, you need to do that bit again and again and again, because now it either sounds sarcastic or just like sad. Because I was like, she's perfect, we may.
Well, it's interesting because I talk about things that other people don't talk about, and then I won't talk about things that everybody talks about. I did a show when my mum was dying about that process of chronic illness and death that is so personal that people were shocked. You know, how can you talk about these things and not? I think of myself as an open book with sealed sections.
Well, that's a really great way of looking at it, because it then allows you a certain sense of privacy, which I think works well when you're in the public eye, that you need to save some things just for yourself. And so do you find that that was a deliberate self-protection measure?
I don't know if it was deliberate, but it has worked to be self-protective. It also helps with, weirdly, it helps with presenting myself to my audience as a non-sexual being, not as a target.
For my brain, not my body.
Yeah, sort of. I'm a big floating head. Don't think about my junk.
See, that's like, because I'm the opposite. I'm like a hypersexual being, so you cannot handle me. Like I have never had groupies, and I'm great at comedy, so I should. And I'm very attractive, even on camera. The camera eats makeup, so it's fine. This is just my day look. But yeah, I find that in my one way, it's too much. So like, I'm so sexual, I'm so open, I'm so everything, that people get kind of intimidated, and it's almost like I'm a kind of cartoon character and not an actual person that they could put things in and out of.
I like to use little surprises about sex and relationships, because I present myself kind of as a brain like you, and also talking about socially unacceptable topics. So I just did an hour show on dead bodies, and I do drop references in there to sex and relationships, and so it comes as a reminder that I'm human, and also a little bit of a shock to the audience, and I think it kind of makes me relatable. But one of the things I'm really curious about is consent in this matter, but also consent generally in comedy. So when I date people, there's a whole range of reactions to say, oh, tell jokes about me on stage, I'll come. And others are just like, totally private, do not share. So I think that it should always be done with fully informed consent if you're going to do it at all. What are your thoughts on?
I structure a consent conversation with my audience about the material I'm going to do, particularly in my trilogy, which is now available as a 6-part podcast. Each of those shows has a moment where I ask the audience if they want to know, if they want to hear about this, if this topic interests them, even if it's just like, can I play a song?
Yeah.
And sometimes my asking them for consent is slightly coercive, like, come on, that's not good enough, you've got to try harder.
Enthusiastic consent.
Yeah, I want, you know, you just did the equivalent of me going, shall I get protection? You went, ugh, I guess. I do want that enthusiastic consent, but I think that's important, particularly when I do talk about upsetting subjects, or I did a whole thing on discomfort. And in that I told jokes deliberately that were pushing the line of comfort, and I needed to get them on board with that, because otherwise that's quite an aggressive thing to do. If they've consented to feeling uncomfortable, that's fun.
Otherwise it's a hostage situation.
Yes, exactly.
I've done a little bit of consent for doing more in mine. So they've signed up to see a show about dead bodies. They know there's going to be discussion of dead bodies, and then it gets pretty full on. And so I say, I find it really hard to see when people have had enough, because I asked the crowd, and someone once said, oh, you could talk to me about dead bodies all night. And someone else went, oh, I think we'll have the vegetarian for dinner. And so I think it's really important to gauge the consent of the audience.
Well, it's also sort of a lie, because you're treating the audience as a single unit, and there might be some people in there who are feeling uncomfortable, and they're being swept along by the group.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't want to brag, but I often perform to more than one person, even in festivals.
That's probably all we've got time for tonight, but where can people find you if they're looking more for your work, Alice?
My blogs and daily stuff is up on my Patreon, patreon.com/Alice Fraser, or I have a website, alicefraser.com.
Lisa-Skye, where can people find you?
Everything at the Lisa-Skye, because the only crime in show business is inconsistent branding.
And you can find me at KC Martinstone on Facebook.